Why is the world so extraordinarily beautiful and, at the same time, so deeply broken? Because both things exist side by side, and they exist very close together. The same human being who composes a symphony capable of making strangers cry together in a dark room also organizes wars that devastate entire continents. The same species that builds hospitals develops instruments of torture. Parents love their children with an intensity that can be frightening, and yet entire families fall apart through silences that last for years. We dream of justice and produce injustice. We long for peace and create new reasons for conflict before the old one has even ended. Everyone has looked around at some point and felt that something doesn't quite fit. An unbelievably beautiful morning and an unbearably painful headline on the very same day. A family dinner that ends in an argument no one really understands how it started. A world with so much potential and so little ability to preserve that potential without ruining everything along the way. There is a book that sets out, among other things, to explain this, not just how everything began, but why everything is still this way. Genesis, the first book of the Bible. 50 chapters that take us from the first day of creation to a man being embalmed in Egypt. And between those 2 points, an investigation into who God is, who human beings are, how evil entered the story, and why hope never disappeared completely, even after everything went wrong. It's worth walking through. The first thing Genesis shows us is a world emerging from chaos and becoming ordered. God speaks, and light appears. He speaks again, and the waters separate. He speaks, and dry land emerges. He speaks, and there is vegetation, animals, stars, rhythms, and cycles. And after each stage, the text repeats one sentence, "And God saw that it was good." That sentence matters, because it tells us that the world didn't begin as something neutral. It didn't begin as something hostile. It didn't begin as a mistake that needed to be corrected. It began good, ordered, intentional, with purpose woven into everything. And the culmination of that creation is the human being, made in the image of God, male and female, given work, marriage, rest, food, a garden, and authority over creation. This isn't survival, it's fellowship. It's living in a well-made world alongside the one who made it. And there, in chapter 2, we find the garden's only prohibition. One tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Don't eat from that one. Every other tree is available. And an important note is needed here, because people often read this part as though God were being stingy. He wasn't. The entire garden was available. One tree, among millions, was set apart. The tree wasn't poison. It was a boundary. It was how human beings could say every day that they understood they were not God. And that is the very tree the story chooses. That's an impressive human talent we still carry today. We're given 1,000 possibilities and stare at the one thing we were denied. If you live in a house with 10 doors and one of them is locked, your brain will spend most of its time thinking about that door. The other 9 simply fade into the background. The serpent arrives and asks a question that sounds innocent. Did God really say you couldn't eat from any tree? And then he twists the truth. He plants doubt. He suggests that God is hiding something, and he makes them a promise. You will be like God. Notice the size of the lie. They were already like God. They had already been made in his image. The serpent offered them, as a future promise, something they already possessed. And the couple fell. And here we find the first great discovery in Genesis. Sin didn't just bring guilt. It threw everything into disorder. It disordered their relationship with God. The couple who once walked with God in the cool of the day now hid behind the trees. It disordered each person's relationship with themselves. They realized they were naked, and nakedness, which had never bothered either of them before, became a source of shame. It disordered their relationship with each other. Adam pointed at the woman. The woman pointed at the serpent. On that very same day, the world's first couple invented the sport of shifting blame, and it disordered their relationship with creation itself. Work, which had existed before, became painful. The ground began producing thorns. Childbirth became suffering. Death entered the vocabulary. One chapter. Every fundamental relationship was broken. And the most remarkable things that humanity inherited this strange ability. The ability to desire the very thing we know will hurt us. And ever since then, we've been perfecting that skill with terrifying dedication. If there were a world championship for making our own lives more complicated, plenty of countries would be fighting for a place on the podium. We're given freedom and invent rebellion. We're given abundance and choose the one thing that was forbidden. We're given rest and create anxiety. We're given relationships and sabotage them. We're given healthy bodies and mistreat them. We're given a beautiful world and pollute it. Genesis isn't naive about human nature. It begins by showing us exactly what we're capable of. And then comes chapter 4. Cain and Abel. The first family had 2 sons. They brought offerings to God. Abel's was accepted. Cain's was not. The text suggests that the difference wasn't in what they brought, but in the condition of their hearts. Cain became furious. God, with incredible patience, warned him. Sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Cain invited his brother into the field and killed him. 1 chapter after the fall, and the world already had murder. Not the murder of a stranger, not the murder of a foreigner. Fratricide, within the same family. This shows us something important. Genesis doesn't romanticize humanity. It doesn't present a perfect first family that slowly became corrupted over time. The first family already knows rivalry, favoritism, envy, violence, and loss. This isn't someone else's problem. It's a problem within the human heart in every generation. Evil spreads throughout the chapters that follow. It grows, becomes more sophisticated, and turns into culture, until we reach chapter 6, where the text makes an incredibly heavy statement. It says that human wickedness was great on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil continually. Continually. This isn't an occasional burst of anger. It's a permanent condition. And then comes the flood. The flood is often told as a children's story, with little animals walking 2 by 2 into a colorful ark. But the book tells a much darker story. It tells us that when evil is treated as normal, it never stays small. It grows. It spreads. It corrupts entire structures. And eventually, the whole creation begins to groan. Noah survives. His family survives. And after the flood, God makes a covenant. A rainbow in the sky. A promise that this would never happen again in the same way. But notice what happens shortly afterward. Noah steps off the ark, plants a vineyard, gets drunk, and lies naked inside his own tent. The same man God used to preserve humanity ends his story in an embarrassing scene. Genesis is relentless on this point. Not even the heroes escape. And then comes Babel. A united humanity decides to build a tower that reaches the heavens, to make a name for themselves, to keep from being scattered. And with subtle irony, the text tells us that God came down to see the city. He came down because despite all the height that tower was supposed to reach, it was still so far from heaven that God had to come down to get a closer look. The scene is funny and sad at the same time. Because humanity keeps doing this. We keep believing that the next technology, the next system, the next breakthrough, the next chapter of progress will finally solve what actually begins inside the human heart. We keep building towers. The bricks change. The illusion stays the same. If we can just climb a little higher, everything will be fixed. It won't. It never has. At Babel, God confuses their languages and scatters them. And here, it seems as though the book is going to end on a bitter note. 11 chapters in, and humanity is scattered, divided, and lost. But Genesis doesn't end at Babel. It does something else. It completely changes scale. From all of humanity, God focuses on one man, an old man named Abram, living in Ur of the Chaldeans, and he says, "Leave your country, leave your relatives, leave your father's household. Go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and all the families of the earth will be blessed through you." That sentence is crucial. All the families of the earth. God hadn't given up on the world. He simply changed the strategy. Instead of starting humanity over from scratch once again, he called one family. He started small, and through that small beginning, he promised to reach everyone. And then Genesis becomes the story of 4 generations: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And here, the book remains remarkably honest. Abraham believes God, but he lies out of fear. Twice, he says his wife is his sister to save his own skin. Isaac repeats his father's mistake. He lies about his wife, too. Spiritual genetics are real. Jacob is a whole story of his own. His name means one who grasps the heel and, by extension, deceiver. And he lived up to his name. He deceived his brother out of his birthright. He deceived his father to receive the blessing. Then he ran away from home. And then God taught Jacob a surprising lesson. He placed him in the household of his uncle Laban. And Laban was even better at deception than Jacob. He switched the bride on Jacob's wedding night. He changed Jacob's wages 10 times. He kept Jacob there for 20 years. Jacob, who had spent his life deceiving others, discovered that there's always someone better at the game. When Jacob returns home, he encounters God during a night of wrestling. He walks away, limping, and he receives a new name: Israel, the one who wrestles with God. From that moment on, he is no longer the same man, even though he continues to carry the marks of who he once was. Then comes Joseph. Joseph is Jacob's favorite son, and his father doesn't hide it. He gives him a special robe that none of the others receive. His brothers hate him. Joseph has dreams in which his entire family bows down to him. He tells his brothers about the dreams. They hate him even more. If there were an award for the most complicated family in the Bible, Jacob's sons would be strong contenders. The brothers sell Joseph into slavery. They pretend he died. They take his robe, soaked in goat's blood, back to their father. Jacob, the deceiver, is deceived by his own sons with a piece of clothing. The irony is painful. Joseph endures slavery, an unjust imprisonment, a false accusation, years of being forgotten. And in the middle of all that, he rises to become the second most powerful man in Egypt. He ends up saving many nations from famine, including the very family that sold him. When his brothers appear decades later, terrified after realizing who he has become, Joseph speaks one of the most important sentences in Genesis. "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Pay attention to both halves of that sentence. He doesn't say the evil wasn't evil. He doesn't say that what his brothers did was somehow fine. He doesn't change its moral category. He calls evil what it is, evil. But he also says that God was able to work through it to preserve many lives. This is one of Genesis's most mature answers. It doesn't teach that everything that happens is good. It teaches that God remains sovereign even when human beings choose deeply evil paths, and that something greater is still being woven together, even within the chapters that hurt. And then the book comes to a close. Genesis began in a garden. It ended with a family burying their father in Egypt, waiting for promises that would still take centuries to be fulfilled. Joseph dies, and the final verse of the book shows him embalmed in a coffin in a foreign land. At first glance, it looks like defeat. It began in a garden and ended in a coffin. But before it closes, the book leaves us a clue. Joseph asks that when God comes to help his people, they take his bones back to the promised land. He doesn't die believing Egypt is the end. He dies believing God has not given up. And this is where Genesis delivers what it came to deliver. The world remains extraordinarily beautiful because it was created by God, and no fall has completely erased the marks of that origin. And it remains deeply broken because human beings shattered what God had made good, and we continue repeating that rupture in new forms every day. Genesis exists precisely to explain why both things remain true at the same time, and to make it clear, from the very beginning of the Bible, that God didn't look at this broken world and walk away. He stayed, and right there, He began a plan to restore everything we ruined. We're still living in this world that is extraordinarily beautiful and deeply broken at the same time. If this video helped you understand our own hearts and God's patience with humanity a little better, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Which of these characters from Genesis stood out to you the most today? Abraham, Jacob, or Joseph? A big hug, and I'll see you next time.